Still looks good? Does this look okay for you guys?
Yeah, I think everything
Yes.
is good. Yeah.
Okay. I'll get going then. Okay. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to tell you guys about some things we've learned about language in the brain over the last, I guess, decade and a half or so. Okay. So today I was going to focus on three main lines of work we have been pursuing. First, I will talk about how language relates to various other capacities that we have as humans. Next, I'm going to zoom in on the language system and discuss its internal structure. And finally, I'm going to talk about some more recent efforts to use neural network language models like ChatGPT. GPT-2 is the earlier version of that, as models of human language processing. Before I do that, I'm going to say just a few words about the methodological foundation of this research enterprise and then give you a brief introduction to the system that I'm going to be focusing about on today, which is the language system. So when I started working on the language system around 2006 or so, I wanted to make sure that I could refer to the same functional areas in the brain across different individuals and across studies. There are many questions I wanted to ask about the system, and I wanted to have confidence that across experiments, I'm studying the same brain regions. And of course, my vision was that eventually we can adopt the same way of defining the language system across labs, across continents, for a true collaborative research enterprise. So I began by developing a so-called localizer paradigm for localizing certain things, right? So we developed a localizer to find language areas quickly and reliably. And to do this, we used a contrast between people reading or listening to sentences, the language condition, and the control condition that is perceptually similar but lacks linguistic meaning and structure, like a sequence of non-words or speech played backwards. A few regions in the left hemisphere respond strongly to this contrast. So here are the language systems of five sample individuals. And as you can see, the general topography is similar, right? Everybody's showing some response in the left frontal and left temporal cortex, but the precise locations, shapes, and sizes of these regions vary quite a lot. Although importantly, this topography is very stable within a given individual over time. So here are maps from two of our participants across three time points, including one that's quite far apart. And I hope you can appreciate the similarity of the activation maps across those time points. But because of this topographic variability across participants, I have been arguing for a bunch of years now that identifying these regions at the level of individual brains is critical for drawing meaningful inferences about them. A couple more quick things on methods. So, first, although much of the work I'll talk about has been done on English, we have developed and released language localizers for many diverse languages now in an effort to increase both the generalizability of our findings, so we don't make claims about language based on English alone, as well as increase inclusivity in language research. So I'm showing you some examples here of native speakers of six languages from our set of many speakers of diverse languages. And second, because individual functional localization may not always be possible, for example, if you want to do some cellular genetic analysis on a postmortem brain, we have created a probabilistic language atlas based on over 800 individuals that we scanned on the language localizer task over the last decade. We now have actually more than 1,200, so we should expand it. But the atlas stabilizes at a couple hundred participants. And so this atlas can be used to estimate for any given location in a template space, like the MNI space or the free surfer space, the probability that this location falls within a language system, in a way creating a universal frame of reference for the language system. So let me say a few words about some key properties of the system I'll be talking about today. So these areas respond both when we understand language, spoken, written, or signed, and when we produce language, also across modalities. Together, these two properties suggest that this system is a likely place where we store our language knowledge, our knowledge of what words mean and how to put them together to express complex ideas. And using this knowledge, we can both encode thoughts into word sequences and decode others' thoughts from their utterances. These properties also show that the language system is distinct from lower level speech perception and articulation systems, which of course are modality specific. These properties, so the classic Broca's and Wernicke's area, as originally discovered, are not part of this system. Broca's area is a lower level speech motor planning area, and Wernicke's area is a lower level speech perception area that extracts word sequences from speech and provides input to the language system during comprehension. But this system I'll focus on today is truly a modal system. So the regions of this network form a highly integrated system with a high degree of synchronized activity. In fact, you can find this network simply from patterns of bold signal fluctuations during naturalistic cognition paradigms like rest, resting state. Here's some evidence from Rod Braga's work. I'm showing you 3 sample subjects' brains, and in each brain there are 2 kinds of data. I'm going to zoom in on one brain here just so it's easier to see. So in black, I'm showing you outlines of this network as defined from just intrinsic bold signal fluctuations, clustering voxels, time courses when people are, lying in the scanner thinking about whatever they are thinking about. And overlaid in yellow and orange are the activations for the language localizer contrast. And there is this amazingly tight correspondence between those two. And if we examine time courses of the 5 core regions while participants listen to a story, the correlations between these regions are on the order of 0.6, 0.7, suggesting that this network is really a meaningful and functionally coherent subset of the brain. Second. The language network also responds to language in different test contexts. So it doesn't matter if you're passively reading or listening or making some judgments about sentences, reading or answering comprehension questions. Basically, whenever interpretable linguistic input is present or is being generated, the system is engaged. And the language network is broadly similar in its topography and properties across diverse languages. I already briefly showed you language maps in native speakers of different languages, but it also holds within bilingual and multilingual individuals. So if you have a brain that, like, I guess all of your guys' brains, where you have a system of mapping between forms and meaning for Farsi, but you also have it for English, your representations and processing of those 2 languages are all done within the same system. So here are maps from 4 multilingual individuals. For each individual, which is a column, I'm showing you maps for 2 of their languages, and hopefully you can appreciate the similarity between the top and the bottom images in each column. Oh, and as you'll notice, one of those languages is actually a conlang, constructed language, Klingon. It turns out it doesn't matter that the language is not a natural language, as long as it's a useful communication system that is generative in the same way that natural languages are, you engage the same brain mechanisms. Finally, we've long known that damage to these regions in adulthood leads to linguistic deficits, aphasia. So these regions are critical for language function. Okay, so let me now tell you about this first line of work, which focuses on the relationship between language and other capacities. Many animals, including humans, do kind of 3 things in the world. They perceive the environment through their senses. They acquire knowledge of the world, and using this knowledge, they reason, make generalizations and predictions, and they physically interact with the world and with conspecifics. So, where does language fall in this tripartite structure? The relationship between language and each of these 3 sets of abilities has been debated over the last bunch of years, but most controversial, of course, has been the relationship between language and cognition, or language and thought. And this relationship is what drew me to neuroscience a bunch of years ago, because for many years I've been, at the time I was reading philosophers, linguists, evolutionary biologists, and anthropologists discussing questions like, are language and thought supported by the same machinery? Are they one and the same? Is thought possible without language? Why did language emerge in our species? Did language make us smart? And pondering these things is fun, but it's even funner to be able to answer these questions, and neuroscience has provided us with tools to do so. I should say that even without empirical data, and in some cases in spite of it, some have offered quite strong opinions on these questions. Many have argued that language and thought share machinery, and that thought is actually not possible without language. So I'll give you a sample quote from Noam Chomsky on the first question, where he writes, the systems of thought use linguistic expressions for reasoning, interpretation, organizing action, and other mental acts. And here's his opinion on the second question. A substantial part of what we call thinking is simply linguistic manipulation. So if there is a severe deficit of language, there will be a severe deficit of thought. Chomsky is not the only one who has placed language at the heart of complex thought. He just has the most colorful quotes to choose from. But I will argue that the evidence actually does not support these answers. Before I turn to the evidence, let me just take a second to say, what do we actually mean by thought? It's a pretty all-encompassing notion. So broadly, thought encompasses our knowledge of the world and reasoning over those knowledge representations, including making inferences and predictions. And we can talk about both kind of general knowledge of the world, but also particular domains like knowledge of the physical properties of objects, knowledge of social agents. Reasoning can also be highly domain general, abstracted away from any particular bases, knowledge bases, right? This kind of reasoning is often linked to the notion of general fluid intelligence and is strongly associated with so-called executive abilities like working memory, attention, cognitive control. In some human cultures, people also develop formal reasoning skills, including math and logic, but these are not cultural universals. So, what is the relationship between the language system and all these other cognitive abilities? There is basically two primary methods we have to answer this question. We have brain imaging tools and we have patient investigations. I'll first tell you, I'll start with fMRI evidence. So over the years, we have tested for overlap between language processing and diverse perceptual, motor, and cognitive abilities across multiple experiments, over 30 experiments now, and with a few hundred participants. In each experiment, we found the language responsive areas and then asked, are these areas also active when we look at faces, do math, or think about what somebody else is thinking? In three gray bars, I'm showing you responses to three different language tasks: sentence listening, sentence reading, and sentence production. In this case, it's describing pictures of common events. And everything is plotted relative to a low-level baseline, like looking at a blank screen. In different colors, I'm now showing you responses to various non-linguistic conditions. And as you can hopefully see, the language areas show strong selectivity for language over diverse inputs and tasks. So these brain areas that work really hard when we process language work about as hard when you're solving a math problem or hold information in working memory as they do when you're looking at a blank screen. Oh, I should say that in this graph, we're averaging across the 5 language areas because their profiles are similar. So any given individual language region will look similar. Critically, these areas don't show much response when we engage in thinking and reasoning tasks. I'm just highlighting some of the domains here for you. And importantly, each of these 79 non-linguistic conditions elicits a very strong response in some other brain area or network of areas. It's just that those areas don't overlap with the areas that process language. I want to quickly show you data from 2 other reasoning tasks. These data are fresh out of the scanner. We're just wrapping up data collection for this project, and a graduate student, Hope Keen, is leading this effort. So the first task comes from work in Josh Tannenbaum's group, and it works like this. So you see some input and some resulting output, and your task is to guess the rule that generated the output. So if the input is 7, 5, and the output is 5, you might have a few hypotheses, like maybe it's take the last element, or take the second element, or take the smallest number, and so on. And then you can test your hypothesis on some new input. Let's say you go with your first hypothesis, and you're told you're wrong. That's not the right answer. So then you get to try again. So maybe you try something like take the first 2 elements, and then you're wrong again. And maybe then you kind of have this aha moment and see that you actually have to remove 7, and you try that, and that works. This kind of inductive reasoning, trying to find a hypothesis that best explains the data, is at the very core of scientific reasoning, as well as reasoning we engage in on an everyday basis since we're very young and come into the world and start learning about the world. So we measured people's brain responses when they engage in generating these hypotheses. And in a control condition, you're told what the rule is and you simply have to apply it. Oh, right. Yeah, I said that. Okay. The second task we've been looking at is a physical reasoning task, which was developed in Nancy Cambridge's lab a few years ago, where you see these kind of unstable block towers, and you have to decide whether more blocks will fall on the red or the green side of the table. And in the control condition, you decide whether there are more blue or yellow blocks in the tower. So the gray bar here again in this data graph is the response during a language task. And here are the responses during these two reasoning tasks, both of which robustly engage a different brain system. So once again, we see that the language system is silent while we think. A complementary approach for understanding the role of language in thinking is to examine cognitive capacities in individuals who lack a properly functioning language system due to aphasia. And most informative are cases of so-called global aphasia, which result from severe damage to the language system, typically due to a large stroke. This kind of damage leads to profound deficits in both understanding and producing language. Right. And Rosemary Varley at UCL has done much of this work, and we've collaborated on some of this. And across many studies, we find that strikingly, in spite of their severe linguistic deficits, these individuals seem to think just fine. All the cognitive abilities we have talked about today, right, like different kinds of reasoning and thinking, appear to be intact. So the only thing that these patients lack is the ability to convert their thoughts into a verbal form and to extract meaningful information from others' linguistic productions. So to come back to these big questions, empirically, it turns out that language and thought really do draw on distinct resources in the brain, and even in the presence of severe language deficits, thinking and reasoning can remain intact. What about these other two questions? Why do we have language? Well, we don't know, of course, but communication sure seems like a plausible hypothesis. There is work across many groups in across the world that has now shown that natural languages appear to really be optimized for efficient information transfer, from how their sound systems are structured to how their words map the conceptual space to their syntactic systems. And it's really not clear why this would be the case if language evolved to primarily engage in this internal thinking. And as to whether language made us smart, I would say the evidence suggests that this is not the case, that language endowed us with some new kind of representations or algorithms. But what it did do is allow for cross-generational transmission of acquired knowledge, building knowledge upon knowledge, which has really transformed our species and allowed us to build the civilizations we have on the planet today. With Ted Gibson and Steve Piantadosi, we have a piece coming soon on this topic. So hopefully we'll be able to share that in the next few months. All right. So the selectivity of the language system that I just highlighted rules out a number of hypotheses about what the system is doing. So, for example, we now know that the language regions respond strongly to sentences, not because these sentences are structured, because other structured stimuli like music or mathematical expressions don't elicit a response. Not because these sentences are meaningful, because pictures of events and videos of events elicit a much lower response. Not because sentences sometimes contain logical arguments or describe mental states, because non-linguistic stimuli with those properties do not elicit a response. And not because sentences are communicative signals, because facial expressions or gestures, again, don't seem to engage these regions. So the possibilities that remain seem to be restricted to something that is specifically to do with linguistic structure or meaning. So let's take a deeper dive inside the system. So what computations could the system support? Well, when you hear or read a sentence, like a red-haired woman is playing with her dog on a beach, there are a few things that you must do to figure out what the sentence means, and that all of you just did. So you're accessing meanings of words from memory, like red-haired woman, dog. I'm showing you these with pictures, but of course, I assume that the meanings are more abstract, and there's good evidence for that. And then you have to use your knowledge of the grammar to determine how words go together to make a complex meaning. So you have to figure out that red haired tells you something about woman as a modifier of woman, that with goes with her dog, and so on. Once you put all the pieces together, you have some kind of a representation of the sentence meaning in your mind. And so, how exactly we retrieve word meanings and how we build these compositional representations remains a matter of debate. But there have been a number of paradigms that have been developed across multiple research groups to engage these operations, which allows us to then look for sensitivity to these different kinds of cognitive demands in the brain. So, for example, to text word retrieval, we can compare the processing of real words, where we have to access meanings from memory, and the processing of non-words, sometimes called pseudo words, which are similar to words but don't map onto any representations in memory, like WUG. And to text cognitive demands associated with sentence construction, we can compare sentences and lists of unconnected words. We can also try to isolate sentence structure building from meaning construction by using stimuli that are inspired by Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky poem, where all the nouns, verbs, and adjectives are replaced by non-words, but all the little words like articles and prepositions stay in place. So it sounds like a fan-byred Molen is glowing with her wug. So you can kind of get a sense of what the broad meaning is, but you can't map anything onto your knowledge of meaning, knowledge of the world. So comparing these stimuli to lists of non-words again, we can try to isolate this kind of more pure sentence structure building. So how do our language regions respond to these different conditions? So here's one sample region in the posterior temporal lobe. And as you can see, sentences, the red bar, which of course are texting both word retrieval and sentence construction, elicit a strong response. This response is stronger than the response to unconnected words, the pink bar, and a list of words in turn elicits a stronger response than non-words, light orange bar. So it looks like this language area is sensitive to both demands associated with word retrieval and those associated with sentence structure building. Is it also sensitive to structure building when meaning cannot be easily inferred? And indeed it is. So here's a Jabberwocky sentence condition, and it elicits a higher response than a list of unconnected non-words. But this is one language area. Do other language areas show a different profile of response? Are any of them, for example, selectively sensitive to retrieving words or just to sentence combinatorics? So here are two other areas, and they show a similar profile. And this profile basically holds across the whole language network, including at a finer spatial and temporal resolution, for example, when probing responses using intracranial recordings. So for now, let's tentatively say that different language regions are functionally similar to each other. They all seem to support word retrieval and sentence structure building. This strong integration between these two aspects of language, retrieval of meanings and putting them together into complex meanings, although contradicting some prior linguistic theorizing, actually makes a lot of sense given the highly contextualized nature of language processing, where interpreting individual words is highly dependent on the preceding words, and properties of particular words are strongly constraining which other words they combine with. So it's hard to think about word retrieval as independent from structure building. Let's dig a little deeper into how we build sentence representations. There basically have been two broad theories, and each of them has multiple variants, but at a broad level, one of the ideas is that we integrate incoming words into representations of the earlier input in memory. And we have difficulties when you have to connect a word to another word far back in the past, because that's taxing your memory, okay? So if we go back to our example, which I changed a little bit here, a woman who is playing with her dog has red hair. When you get to has, you have to retrieve woman from memory to establish a connection between them. And at that point, it's been a while, right? You've processed 6 other words in the interim, so there is some cost to forming this non-local dependencies. Ted Gibson was among the first to propose this idea. And there's a lot of evidence for this a cost that you can measure behaviorally. An alternative story is quite different and was developed by Roger Levy, among others. The key idea here is that comprehension involves actively predicting likely upcoming words. So at her, you may be expecting something like child or some plausible pet like a dog. So if you get something like giraffe, you're surprised. And there's a cost associated with processing this relatively unexpected element. And again, behaviorally, there's evidence for surprisal costs as well. So Corey Shane and Edan Blanc spent some time evaluating these theories with respect to neural responses in the language areas. And they took a more kind of naturalistic approach where they just had participants listen to some stories while lying in the scanner. And in these stories, the two theories make a prediction for each word about the expected processing difficulty. I'm showing it here for just a couple of snippets, just to visually illustrate that in many places, the two accounts made distinct predictions. So lighter colored words in each of these things are predicted to be more difficult to process by the dependency locality theory, where long distance dependencies are hard, or by surprisal theory in the bottom box, where unexpected elements are hard. What we find in the brain, and I'm showing you again 3 sample language areas, is that similar to what's been found in behavioral work, both theories predict some independent variance in neural responses, including after rigorous control for other factors that affect comprehension difficulty. Note that now the baseline is not fixation anymore. The baseline now is the average response to a word across these stories. And these effects I'm showing you are extra costs due to these factors. And they're controlling for variance associated with one another. So they're independent chunks of variance. So these results suggest that for sentence construction, we have evidence for both integration processes, where incoming words are connected to representations of earlier input in memory, and prediction processes. Where comprehenders form expectations about upcoming words and then are surprised if those expectations are violated. And we see these effects in all language areas, but importantly, not in regions outside of this network. For example, not in regions that are sensitive to general difficulty across demanding tasks. And this gives more credence to this no answer to the question about potential differences among the language areas. Okay, so I've now shown you two kinds of effects related to language processing, right? So on the one hand, there's a stronger response to structured stimuli like sentences than to unstructured stimuli like lists of words. But there's also a stronger response to input that is more difficult to process. In recent work, this has now come out in Nature Human Behavior, Greta Tuchkuta, a graduate student, brought these two effects together in a single study. She examined neural responses to 2,000 sentences sampled from a massive corpus of naturalistic text. So here are some examples of those stimuli. I put sentences in scare quotes because if you draw from naturally occurring spoken and written strings, you sometimes pull out quite messy examples, but this is here by design. And she also collected ratings of grammatical acceptability from independent participants, basically asking how good is this a sentence of English, which allowed us to then look at the level of bold response in the language areas as a function of sentence acceptability. And what you see is basically this non-linear relationship. You can see it a little more clearly in the inset, where responses are average in each of 6 acceptability bins. And there are error bars on those dots. They're just tiny because there are so many sentences in each bin. Oops. Sorry, just lost my, oops, here. Oh, there it is. And so you see that basically strings that are not well formed are similar to our word list condition from earlier studies. It's kind of hard to make sense of them, and they elicit a relatively low response. Strings that are more well formed elicit a stronger response. So we're capturing this continuum from less well formed to more well formed linguistic input. But then strings that are really well formed and very easy to process, involve common structures and easy to access words, again elicit a lower response. So we're also capturing this climb from easy to process to more difficult to process input. This study also sheds further light on the similarity of the functional profiles of different language regions, because we can ask how similar are the different regions' preferences for these particular sentences, right? Previously, we've looked mostly at kind of groups of conditions, at patterns of different conditions where a bunch of stimuli are lumped together. This is a much, much finer grain. We can say, do two different language regions like the same sentences? And indeed, we find that these preferences are very similar. So this is just a correlation for a sample pair of regions. And here's the full correlation matrix for the 5 language areas. And you can see that these regions have similar preferences for different kinds of linguistic input. So at this point, I'm happy with a pretty solid no answer to the question about differences among the different components of the language network, at least given the data we have so far from a whole bunch of experiments. But let's consider another dimension of potential differences among different language areas. Let's ask whether there are any regions that may be more important for language than other regions. And indeed, evidence from aphasia has long suggested that damage to the posterior temporal component of this network is associated with more severe and longer lasting deficits. Here's a quote from modern day aphasiologist Stephen Wilson, but you can find similar quotes from older classic writings on aphasia. And this is based on a recent large scale investigation of recovery trajectories. He wrote, not to imply that other brain regions play no role in sentence comprehension, but only the posterior temporoparietal region is truly indispensable. But if this area has a special status for language function, we should see this manifest in other ways as well. And it turns out we do. I'm going to show you quickly 3 strands of recent evidence suggesting that this region may be a core, most critical component of the language system. So first, remember how linguistic input that is more difficult to process elicits higher responses in the language areas. And this effect is present across all the different language areas, but it turns out that very easy to process sentences only elicit a response in the posterior temporal area. So here's how the responses look in this area: a parametric modulation by sentence difficulty, right? Hard sentences elicit the highest response, medium, and this is measured here by surprisal. Medium sentences are in between, and easy sentences are low. And you see the same general pattern in other areas, for example, the inferior frontal region. But check this out. The easy sentences don't elicit a response that's above the fixation baseline. So you're not engaging this part of the language network to process, can we go for a walk, or they had other things to do. And I think this is the first time when we really don't see a language area engaged when people process language. The second line of evidence comes from polyglots. So these are individuals who speak 5 or more languages. And a little while ago, we reported that polyglots and hyperpolyglots are individuals who speak 10 or more languages, have smaller language networks. So when they process their native language, the responses are weaker and less spatially extensive than in non-polyglots. And we've replicated this effect in a new group of polyglots just in recent work. And looking into it more, we discovered something interesting. So some polyglots don't show any reliable above baseline responses to native language in their inferior frontal areas. I'm highlighting this effect here for you. So for some polyglots, processing their native language seems to be so effortless that it can be done focally within the left posterior temporal lobe. Finally, I'll mention a cool case from our so-called Interesting Brains project, where we investigate individuals with highly atypical brains, but normal-like cognition. So we have an individual who found out at age 40 that she has a massive cyst in her left hemisphere. She's a successful medical professional, had no reasons to suspect that her brain was in any way unusual, but in her brain, there is no frontal language component to be had. The areas that would typically house these areas have been replaced by cerebrospinal fluid. Instead, her language system consists of just a few small temporal areas and appear to be quite sufficient to produce and understand language. So, complementing evidence from aphasia, the posterior temporal language areas seem to be always engaged when we process language and appear to be sufficient to support language. So, taking stock of the second part, so the language system supports both word retrieval and sentence structure building during comprehension and production. This is true of all the different language regions, so they all show these kinds of response profiles. But the posterior temporal component appears to be more critical than other language regions for language function. So finally, let's talk about large language models. Could these models that have taken the world by storm be useful to researchers who are trying to understand how language works in humans? And I think very much so. These are, after all, the first computational models that truly excel at language. I no longer need to show you demos of how impressive these models are. You've all had a chance to interact with GPT style models to witness their linguistic prowess. Um, these models learn aspects of language that have long been argued to be impossible to learn from distributional information alone, settling decades old debates about language learnability. Moreover, these models are similar to the language network in a few ways. Like the language system, they're sensitive to both word meanings and abstract syntactic rules. And as in the human brain, there doesn't seem to be separation between the processing of linguistic structure and meaning, such that the very same units in the model contribute to both. And of course, predictive processing is a core feature of language models and plausibly the very foundation of their success. And evidence has been accumulating for human comprehension being predictive. So, inspired by these similarities, we asked whether large language models might also be similar to the language system in a finer grain in terms of the actual representations they build when they process linguistic input. To ask this kind of question, you can use the following approach. You basically take a language stimulus, a sentence, and you feed it to a model, and you also present it to a human participant. From the model, you extract hidden unit activations from some layer, and from the brain, you get responses from the language areas recorded with fMRI or intracranial recordings. And then you use these two sets of numbers to compute some similarity metric between them. You can, for example, build an encoding model based on a linear regression from unit activations to neural responses, and then test how well this model predicts human responses to new stimuli. The values I'll be showing you are basically these cross-validated correlations. And I should clarify that by responses here, I just mean the level of activity to different sentences in language responsive voxels or electrodes. So this approach is exactly what's been done in similar studies on the ventral visual stream, where convolutional neural nets, models of object recognition, have been shown to be similar to primate visual processing. Using this approach, Martin Schrimp led an effort to compare representations from 43 language models against human data sets. Each bar on this plot will be a model, and the majority are transformers. Similar models are grouped by color. And on the y-axis, I'll show you how well each model predicts human neural responses in the language system. So here's what we find. The gray ceiling line here is based on the internal reliability of the data set, so how well you can predict a given individual's response from those of other participants. So it's about as well as you can expect an artificial model to predict responses. And as you can see, models vary quite a lot, but some models in a class of unidirectional transformers do really well in capturing human neural responses. So the answer here appears to be yes. At least for some models, the representations of linguistic input are similar to human representations. And this result has been replicated by a few independent. These models weren't built to model a human language system or the human brain in any way. They were built by engineers to do language tasks. And yet, in spite of this, somehow both models and human brains converge on a similar representational space. So then we asked, why is it that some models are better than others? In vision, it's been found that models that do better on object recognition also provide a better match to primate visual responses. Language models are, of course, trained on word and context prediction. So is it the case that models that do better on this task also provide a better fit to human neural data? And indeed, we find this relationship strongly, such that next word prediction performance robustly predicts correlations with brain data. Individual models are now dots here. And I should say that this relationship appears to be quite selective. If you look at how well these models perform on other language tasks like for those of you familiar, there's a so-called glue benchmark where there's tasks like judging sentences grammaticality or similarity of sentence meanings, and performance on those tasks is not predictive of the degree of brain alignment. So the selective relationship between performance on next word prediction and brain similarity suggests that optimizing for predictive representations may be a critical objective for both biological and artificial neural networks for language. Plausibly, because accurately predicting upcoming words encourages a system to basically build a joint probability model of the linguistic signal, implicitly requiring sensitivity to different kinds of regularities in the signal. We have been building on this work from a couple years ago in various ways. Recently, I'll mention a couple of more recent findings. So, the most common criticism of language models as models of human language processing is that they're not trained in developmentally plausible ways. And that's totally true, both in terms of the amount and kind of data, the nature of the training process. It's very unlike how kids learn language. But Eqbal Hosseini showed that you actually don't need massive amounts of training data to achieve good model to brain alignment. So, training on as little as 100 million tokens, which is about what a kid gets, is estimated to get during the first 10 years of life, you already get quite good brain alignment. And Qinju Zhuang now, who is a postdoc in the lab, is now training models not just on less data, but also on data that much more closely resemble the input that human children get to see if models trained in this way would better align with human responses to language, including trying to also see if we can recapitulate the trajectory, developmental trajectory, by looking at brain imaging data from kids at different ages. Greta Chkute, a graduate student, showed that language models represent linguistic input similarly enough to humans to actually allow for what's called non-invasive modulation of neural responses. I'll unpack that for you. So she used responses to 1,000 sentences to train an encoding model. So this result basically is a replication of the findings from shrimp, where uh, learning a relationship between language representation, language model representations and bold responses generalizes to other sentences. This is cross-validated correlation. But then she searched a massive language corpus for strings that the encoding model would predict to elicit really high responses. Right? So she's basically extrapolating this regression. So we call these stimuli drive sentences. And here are some examples of those stimuli. As well as really low responses. We call these suppressed sentences. So then she brought in totally new participants and collected data on both the original set of sentences and these new candidate sets of drive and suppressed sentences. And indeed, these sentences elicit the desired neural response, much higher than baseline for drive and much lower for suppress. And this is really the first demonstration of a closed loop stimulus design approach for a high level cognitive domain. Um, Another thing we're trying to do is kind of stress testing the language models. This is again work by Eqbal Hosseini, where he's trying to select stimuli for which different models have as different representations as possible to allow us to see which model is actually better. Because right now we have quite a few different models that perform quite well in capturing human neural responses. And oh, Oh yeah, and then another thing we're doing. This is work by Karina Kauf and Greta Tuchkuta again, where we're systematically investigating which linguistic features reliably contribute to a model-to-brain mapping performance. So remember the setup we have, which is how we do this work. So what I've shown you already that a model representations appear to be similar to those in the human language system. But of course, a representation of a sentence has a lot of information. So in this line of work, Karina and Greta carried out a bunch of experiments where the sentences were perturbed in various ways before being fed to the model. So for example, you can scramble the order of words, you can remove some words, or paraphrase the sentence for each of these manipulations. And in this way, you can evaluate the effect of how well the model representation of the perturbed stimulus captures human neural responses, to basically ask how critical are these different aspects of representations for the model to brain similarity. And they effectively find that word meanings are the key contributor to this similarity. Okay. Computations. And although different regions of the language system seem to be functionally similar, the posterior temporal component appears to be most critical for language function. Finally, I've shown you that representations that are extracted from large language models are in some ways similar to those in the human language system, which makes them promising as candidate models of human language processing. And we're trying to leverage the similarity in many ways in ongoing work. So I'll mention very briefly just a few ongoing directions, and then I'll stop. So now that we have established that the language system is sharply distinct from perception, cognition, and action, we're trying to actually ask the harder question of how does a language system work together with those distinct systems? Because, of course, language has to interact with all sorts of other systems because we use language to learn new information, to share ideas and feelings, to build relationships, give instructions, and so on. So we are probing this relationship between the language system and other systems across a few different domains, um, uh, including social cognition. I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit here to in the interest of time. So yeah, we're looking at social cognition, abstract meanings, abstract conceptual representations, formal reasoning like logic and math, goal-directed behaviors, and real-world like scenarios. And interactions with vision, especially during language learning, where grounding, visual perceptual grounding, has been shown to be important. We're continuing to investigate the processing of language in bilingual and multilingual minds. So this is work by Saima Malik Moraleda, who is just about to get her PhD in the lab. We are looking at language across the lifespan, both asking how the language system emerges, including in toddlers, which is an age where language processing has not been much studied in neuroscience because it's hard to put kids in scanners. You can do it with infants and older kids, but not 1 and 2-year-olds, but we're trying. And we're also looking at how the system changes as we age. I mentioned this interesting brains project, which I'm happy to talk about more, which is a kind of a cool lens to try to understand which constraints on the organization of the brain are hard constraints and which are more flexible. And we're looking at recovery of language function from aphasia, trying to understand why some individuals recover better than others, what kind of systems help this recovery process, and so on. And a few other things we're doing is looking at parts of the language system outside of these core frontal and temporal areas, including the right hemisphere homotopic regions and like regions like, for example, in the cerebellum and the hippocampus, there's little areas that respond to language, and we don't yet understand as a field how those regions may contribute to language comprehension production. And then we're on a forever quest to understand the linguistic computations, including by leveraging temporally resolved approaches with collected with intracranial recordings, including in recent work with single cellular recordings. So I think I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much for listening.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Ev. Is there any question? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your great presentation. I have a question about language laterality, and I want to ask that is it possible that some people have almost zero language lateralization? I mean, they have the whole left hemisphere or both hemisphere get activated during their language processing instead of their temporal cortex or IFG?
Yeah, we certainly see quite a lot of variability in lateralization, including in neurotypical individuals. Although most individuals, about 90%, shows some degree of left hemispheric bias. There's a class of individuals, a subset of individuals who show quite bilateral responses, and there's some who actually show right lateralization, so atypical lateralization. Interestingly, more bilateral responses have been reported in diverse developmental disorders, including disorders that don't really have to do with language specifically. And there are some stories for why and how the right hemisphere may be maladaptive in those cases. And there's even some studies that link the degree of right hemisphere responses during language to behavioral outcomes, like how well these individuals communicate. But there is a lot we don't understand yet about the trade-off between those two components, two hemispheric components. And certainly in neurotypical individuals, even these atypically lateralized individuals seem to be totally fine. So it doesn't seem, although prevalent, it doesn't seem like the left hemisphere bias in a typical brain is critical for being good at language by any measure, like vocabulary, speed of processing, and so on.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emilian, for your excellent talk. I had a question about the similarity between the neural system and the large language models. You discussed about that we can bring them to a common space to like similarity metrics. But my question is that in the case of similarity, I think the core and fundamental part of the large language models are the LLM are things are blocks like LSTM, which have recurrent connections and the and a history and a history block. Do have has been any investigations about finding the similar blocks in the language models like posterior temporal cortex? I mean the a history block and recurrent connections to similar to the LSTM or RL.
I mean, there's a couple of questions packed into your question. I mean, so in general, people have definitely compared, including us, compared different kinds of models, including LSTMs and transformers. On the surface, it seems that transformer architectures do better than LSTMs in capturing human neural responses. That said, when you're comparing models, a lot of work takes off-the-shelf models, where of course there's many, many differences aside from the architecture alone, right? There's maybe differences in training, in the kind of data that the models are trained on. So I think what's going to be really important in the coming years is taking models that are minimally different, right? So taking an LSTM architecture and a transformer architecture that are matched for size and only differ in that architectural feature, right? Training them on the same amount of data, on the same kind of data, and doing these minimal pair kind of carefully controlled comparisons to try to actually zero in on what are the features that are necessary and sufficient to give you a high degree of similarity to human language responses. And a lot of that work, of course, is currently ongoing across many labs, but there is a lot to do yet. The challenge becomes that some of the better models are not open models, so there's challenges, and we can sometimes get their internal representation. Sometimes it's hard. The other models, the models that we can get access, they're smaller, maybe some limitations and the kinds of conclusions we can draw. But we're trying our best, and a few other groups are as well. So I think we'll get somewhere. Yeah. I mean, I think another thing to maybe say is that most of this work has focused on responses to kind of sentence level stimuli instead of trying to predict similarities during incremental processing. Like as you add each word to the representation, for this, of course, you need something like intracranial recordings from humans where you have that time course information. And so we're trying to do some of that as well now.
Thank you so much for your great talk, and that was really interesting for me. You show that in the works done by Martin Schrimp, a large variety of language models are similar to what is happening in our brain. I'm really curious to know that is there any evidence about the similarity of reasoning to previous contexts or weighting mechanism to previous contexts when we are predicting the upcoming word? Because as I know, one of the shared mechanisms between our brain and language models is that they are both are continuously engaging in prediction of the next word. I'm really interested to know that how exactly they are predicting the upcoming word, and can we use language models to know that which of the previous words in the context has the more influence in our prediction.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think there's a lot of work on in the NLP area on this, trying to understand the nature of prediction in language models and trying to relate them to human prediction performance. Um, I mean, what one thing to say is that I didn't focus on this today, but one thing we've learned is that the human language system, the system I've talked about, actually tracks only very local context, just a few words long. Because I think this system fundamentally cares about constructing syntactic representations in these shorter scales. And then it passes information to some downstream systems that actually do reasoning. Of course, in large language models, all of that is happening in the same system, right? In fact, the longer the context, the better the models do. But one natural question is, given that in the human brains it seems like we have this emergent division between systems that track really relatively short local context and systems that track longer context, these letter systems are no longer language specific. They also track long context when we, for example, watch movies or process kind of auditory sequences that can tell a story and so on. uh, Whether something like some division like that may also be emerging in language models. So there's a lot of effort to try to kind of take the models apart and see if you can track these different lengths of context in the organization of the language model. Shaili Jain has been doing some of that work, but yeah, but there's a lot to understand still, using both behavioral and neural approaches, I think.
So if there is a question in the comment section, I think it's kind of relevant to this last question, I guess.
Is there any hierarchical processing built into this language network akin to CNN models of primate vision? Or are they mostly connected in a recurrent fashion? But that's related to more to the LSTM question. I mean, we don't know yet, right? Like these are all very coarse kinds of inferences we're making, where we take models and we compare their representational spaces. We're not making any claims about implementation, and nobody else should, right? All we can infer is that something is similar about the representational spaces when we and models process linguistic input. Um, so, I'm hoping that we'll have some traction on these kinds of questions later, including through these controlled model to brain comparisons where you take two minimally different models to try to isolate the features that really, really drive the similarity to the brain. But yeah, we don't have the answers quite yet.
I want to somehow more precisely tell you about something that is in my mind. And that is, if we extract some representation that is related to the reasoning of the model, for example, something like attribution that or importance score of the previous word in the context, and then try to predict brain activity like something that has been done using hidden states of the models. And as I have done something similar to this in my master thesis, I was able to predict brain activity significantly in lots of voxels that are involved in language processing, as you had shown in your previous works. Um, Something that is really interesting for me to know that is it really tell us that the features that come from the reasoning of the model, and we are able to predict brain activity. This tell us that maybe there are something similar about the reasoning in these two systems.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know what you mean by reasoning, right? Linguistic prediction, not quite reasoning. I mean, there is something similar about how these models predict and how humans predict, although there's also differences because, like I was answering your previous question, but there's certainly similarities, and like these relationships that we find between how well a model can predict upcoming words and how similar the model is to the brain. There's something there. There's something important about this predictive function. But of course, there's also, nobody has systematically compared models that are trained on prediction compared to some other objective function. And the reason, again, is because these models come from engineering, right? The next word prediction function has been wildly successful for good reasons. And so people just stick with it and keep building on that. There may be other objective functions that would do something similar. And that's worth trying to think hard about. But there's clearly something that's similarly predictive about how humans process language and about how models do it. And it sounds like you're doing great work trying to zero in on some of the mechanisms of how that happens, and that sounds really useful.
So much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you for talking to us. Does the activity in language areas changes in aphantasia? Aphantasia, I don't know.
Yeah, so for those of you who may not know,
Thank
aphantasia is a condition where individuals cannot engage in visual imagery. I'm not aware of anybody that has systematically compared this, but I don't know. I'm not sure why you might expect that. I mean, the visual imagery doesn't really have much to do with language, right? I mean, there is a interesting question about whether it's different in individuals who do or don't have an inner voice, right? Just like there's people with aphantasia who can't engage in visual imagery, there are individuals who don't have an inner voice. I don't know if you like raise your hand and nobody here, but it turns out that about like 20 to 25% of people just don't know what you're talking about when you say you have an inner voice and you like hear a voice in your head and you talk to yourself. They're like, maybe go see a psychiatrist. This is not good. So they just really don't have that percept. And I have a former graduate student, postdoc, Anya Ivanova, who is now at Georgia Tech, who is trying to understand differences in both cognitive and neural architecture as a function of this phenomenological experience of having or not having this inner voice thing. Um,
Uh, so, if can I ask one more question and then
sure,
probably end the session? So,
sounds good.
in the vision domain, we have something called adversarial examples, and those examples are used to argue that human visual system does not work the same way as convolutional neural networks do. So
Mhm.
I'm wondering whether we have adversarial examples for transformers and large language models, and if so, then can you explain how those
Uh, across those high performing models, right? So you can imagine constructing a representational similarity space for some set of stimuli and then trying to kind of replace stimuli until that matrix is as different as possible across a few candidate models, right? So we call them, controversial stimuli. Okay. So then we were hoping, we were kind of expecting that now, if we look at the responses in humans to those stimuli, it will tell us clearly, okay, this model is really much better aligned with humans, and other models kind of falter, right? So we'll find like a clear winner among those models. But it turns out that for those models, none of the models can predict human brain responses. All models struggle. So, in a way, by selecting a subset of stimuli which are represented very differently among high performing language models, we kind of found like a blind spot for all models. None of the models can predict these responses. And the data are just as good, like the ceiling is just as high. There's no problem with the data. Humans are very consistent to each other. So, again, it's not like humans just don't know what to do with those stimuli. They're perfectly fine stimuli. And so it seems that what we found is that the axes of representation that are shared between models and humans are also axes that are shared across language models. So that once you go off of these axes by choosing stimuli that models disagree on, we're kind of also disturbing the similarity between the ability to align between model spaces and human spaces. So Ekbal should have, he presented this work at CCN, Computational Cognitive Science, last year, and we're just writing up a paper on this. So hopefully there'll be more to say there. And we're now trying to think about kind of the issue of the universality of representations in this context. What are these key axes that seem to allow us to align models to brains? Can we say something about how meanings or linguistic meanings are represented? What are those key axes? You know, those are hard questions that people have made some progress on, but not so much.
And actually, it might be interesting if you check the individual differences among humans when they are scanned in response to those controversial stimuli, um, like similar to diversity that you see among models. You may also see that humans also have show some sort
They
of
seem similar. Humans seem similar. So it seems like
I,
humans to each other do something similar when they process these sentences, but models just can't predict that.
I
Um,
see.
yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. Do you want to ask that? So, from each speaker, we ask one question. Do you want to ask that question? I think that's an important question.
I wanted to ask you if you have any encouraging comments or if you want to share your experience with our young fellow female researchers here.
Yeah, that's a hard one. Uh, I mean, I think the bottom line. So, I mean, I've had a pretty challenging path in many ways, but uh, I think if you keep doing good work, you can eventually make it. And I think just finding support from other female academics is helpful. Oftentimes, even very well meaning male academics who want to support women in science and who do all they can to advance academia. So it's all, I found it very helpful to have both male and but also critically female mentors who can kind of help you navigate this path. But yeah, the world is a strange place these days, but I am a firm believer in meritocracy. I think if you do good work and you work hard, eventually things will work out. But I'm also an optimist, so that has helped me, I think, just kind of to keep going when things were hard. But yeah, I'm always happy to help and give advice if I can be of use. So please feel free to reach out or whatever. But yeah, and then like once you make it, right, try to give back to the field by training other women and other minorities to keep the field growing in its diversity. Like I see training young women as a core objective in my work and trying to make sure that their careers are successful. So yeah, best of luck, and I
Thank you.
wish
We
you all.
deeply appreciate it. We wish you the best of luck in both your profession and your life.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Take care. Bye.